Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Greg Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reski.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
Welcome back to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Greg Bryan, and I'm joined with my friend Jim Reski. We are here tonight to discuss 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Really looking forward to diving into this. It's one of the most important passages, chapters 8 and 9, on the whole topic of giving in the church and generosity. And so I think this will be kind of a fun discussion, might be shorter than normal. What do you think, Jim? Short or long?
I don't know. It depends how you feel about giving, Greg.
That's a good point. Well, we're really glad you're with us. Jim, let's just dive in. Could you read the first 7 verses and then?
You bet. Here we go. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, and I'm reading from the English Standard Version tonight, if that matters to anyone. Here we go. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means, of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this, not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. Accordingly, we urge Titus that as he had started, so he should complete among you this act of grace. But as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, and knowledge, in all earnestness, and in our love for you, see that you excel in this act of grace also.
Starting in verse 8, I say this not as a command, but to prove by the earnestness of others that your love is also genuine. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you, by his poverty, might become rich. And in this matter I gave my judgment. This benefits you, who a year ago started not only to do this work, but also to desire to do it. So now finish doing it as well, so that your readiness in desiring it may be matched by your completing it out of what you have. For if the readiness is there, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. For I did not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but that as a matter of fairness, your abundance at the present time should supply their need, so that their abundance may supply your need, that there may be fairness. As it is written, whoever has gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. So let's pause there, Jim. What do you know about the historical background of this little passage here? There was a famine in Jerusalem, apparently.
Right.
And the church in Jerusalem had tremendous financial needs.
Yes.
And so Paul was going around asking churches that he had started to collecting money to help them out in their time of dire need. So it sounds like to me from this reading that the Corinthians had started to do that, but then because of this controversy, they kind of put it on hold and stopped.
And I think what I read, Greg, you're right. Yeah, I think that's all right. And then that's all true. And then what I read also is that a lot of other churches had given, that they had come through with their pledges, but these guys had made a pledge. And I think part of that you read in verse 10. In this matter, I give my judgment. This benefits you, who a year ago started not only to do this work, but also to desire to do it. So something they kind of started and then didn't come through with. So part of this lesson is, do what you say you're going to do. You said you were going to do this and help support it. And then when it came time to actually do it, you didn't come through. Right. So that's kind of one of the lessons there, but it sounds like they had started it a year ago, and then he's kind of reminding them about it and ask them to come through.
So I think some of the interesting applications we can make from this passage is, have you ever heard people say you should never talk about money in church.
Yeah. Or
Yeah.
people just resent when the church does talk about money. Right.
Right. Well, here we have a classic example of like the Apostle Paul talking about money very openly because there's a real need. And so I think that it's okay to talk about money in church. And it's funny how we get so defensive when we are asked, when someone makes a financial appeal. I know at times I felt that way, like that uncomfortableness. The whole principle of generosity,
Right,
is so important in the Christian life, realizing that we don't own anything. And even the very money we have is not even, is a gift from God.
right.
And yet we feel like we don't want to let go of it.
Yeah, I think that's the key to the whole section. That is
Yeah.
absolutely the key to unlock the whole section. Verse 9.
Yeah, you want to read it?
Yeah. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich. So what he's doing there is he's bringing the whole gospel right into this whole idea, right? Because he could just say, look, this is what you're supposed to do. Now just do it, right? And that's what you're supposed to do. And there's nothing here to discuss. Your obligation, you made this pledge, come through, end of discussion. I mean, he could have like laid down the law for them. But
so we could call this like gospel generosity.
We can and should call it gospel driven generosity, because
Gospel driven generosity. Yeah.
Yeah,
I like
yeah.
that.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what he's doing, and it's a big principle here that there's a way to approach your Christian life and your growth in Christ to say, here's the command, just do it. So many times the Bible just doesn't do it that way. It says, here's what you're supposed to do. So the general pattern is always, here's the standard you're supposed to keep, but the standard you're supposed to keep is way higher than you thought. You're supposed to be free from the love of money, not just giving a little bit of your money, like 10% of your money is a guideline. People use the tithe guideline. Not you think, oh, that's the rule, that's the standard. But then the real rule is you should be free from the love of money entirely. You shouldn't wrap your life around money. You shouldn't be living for money. The standard that God's what he has in mind for you is way higher than you thought it was. And you get to the point where you say, I can't do that. I can't be that generous. Like, what do you want for me to give it all? And then you say, right, you are failing. The standard is higher than you thought. You're not meeting it. In some ways, you can never meet it, but there is one who met it for you. Jesus had it all. He had everything to lose. He didn't need you for anything. And out of unbelievable generosity, he set all that aside. And so therefore, yet here's the standard. It's higher than you thought. You can't keep it. There's one who kept it for you. Therefore, it changes your desire to do it. So you desire to change and follow him from the inside out, not the outside in.
I love the way Paul wrote this. I mean, and how he's reminding them of the gospel. Like it really truly is gospel driven generosity. And he's appealing to them on the basis of the gospel. So we see, in verse 1 that gifts should be brought to the church. We see in verses 2-9 that gifts should come from the heart. And then we see that gifts should be measured proportionately in verses 10-15. And then the gifts should be handled honestly at the end of the chapter. But that third point, the proportional thing, it's interesting. He kind of quotes a passage that goes back to the manna. I don't know if you caught that.
No, where?
Verse 15. Whoever has gathered much had nothing left over.
Oh,
Whoever gathered little had no lack.
You're right. That is a reference to the manna, right? What do you think that means? Why did you bring that up at that moment?
It's basically share the wealth, I think. I think it's like, hey, right now the church in Jerusalem, has a desperate need, and you guys are doing pretty well. So we need to spread the wealth over to Jerusalem. There could be a time when Jerusalem's thriving and you guys are suffering. And so it's just kind of like spreading the manna out. Don't collect too much for yourself. Remember the guy who collected like 2 days, more than a day's worth, and then it was like rotting with it didn't last,
Right.
And it is kind of interesting just to think about, we've all heard the statistics. Even though Americans tend to be really generous people, they still fall so short of, Christians, from my understanding, still fall so short of even the 10%.
Right.
So
Do you think so let me ask you, do you think the 10% rule applies in the New Testament today? Because some people say that's an Old Testament rule, that's part of the law. Now it's just a guideline. What do you think in your own life? Do you think that's
I think it's a starting point.
okay?
I think it's a good starting point, but I don't think it necessarily applies, because I think what this passage talks about, sometimes it's like radical generosity,
Right.
where
It'd be way
we're
more than
called
that.
to give more.
Right.
For example, you might get a tax refund of like, $2,000, and then God puts it on your heart to give the whole thing to somebody, to give half of it away.
Right. Right. And be a real blessing to them.
But I think the point is, it's to really have your heart attuned to God and his kingdom and the needs. And you and I, we can't meet all the needs out there. Like
Right.
if you're like me, you get like mail every day with some sort of financial need in it,
Right.
and you can't do it all. But I bet you've had the experience where the Lord puts it on your heart to give to a certain need, or a certain ministry, or certain and that's, I think, what we're called to do.
Absolutely. And there's something you were saying at the beginning of the podcast about, a lot of people resist it or feel like we shouldn't talk about it in church or don't want to talk about it in church. But I think part of that is what you just described. People get jaded because you do get requests from every angle so many times. And then, well, I just know, yeah, being with other believers and you're in a church service, then here comes the money pitch. Oh, here it comes. Now they're going to ask for my money. And people do get jaded about that after a while. But I really love this idea that you brought in, and I didn't see it until you mentioned it, so I really appreciate it. The manna in verse 15, the manna from heaven, because that whole story was the whole story of daily dependence on God, right? It was, you can't store it up, and like like the common phrase we'll say is, you can't take it with you, you can't store it up, right? But yet we still want to store it up, and as a Christian, you say, it doesn't belong to you, it all belongs to him, but I want to act like it belongs to me and store it up. And God's saying, you've got to realize you got to live in daily dependence on me, right? And
it's like that parable where the guy builds the bigger barns,
yeah, right.
and then he dies.
You fool, this night your life is required of you, because he was trying to live in independence from God. He's saying, I have enough stuff and wealth and means that I have no need for him anymore. And God says, no,
So this is where the
right
idea of living for eternity, I think, is so important, because I'm going to probably use this when I teach.
Okay.
I'm going to purchase or find a big rope.
Oh.
And I'm going to say, this rope represents your life. And I'm going to imagine that the first like 6 inches of the rope is like orange or something. And then the rest of the rope just goes. And I'm going to say, this rope represents your life. This orange part represents your earthly life. And the rest of it represents eternity. Why do we spend so much time focused on this orange part? And what we do is we go like, I'm really saving up as much money as I can so that I can enjoy that last inch of my orange, the retirement, right?
Right.
Why, where I think the biblical concept is invest in eternity.
Yeah.
Like, what's going to last?
Right.
What's going to last? And how can I invest in eternity? And I think this is part of the big theme of these chapters. And so that's a clue, I think, of where I'm going in my teaching.
Oh, I did want to mention something else, because we kind of jumped right to that pivotal verse where the gospel comes up in verse 9. But this whole first paragraph from verses 1 through 7, it did feel a little bit like, to that point, like he was shaming them a little bit. I heard this parenting thing a long time ago, and I don't know if it's a good parenting technique, but I heard it. And I have 3 kids. So once in a while, one kid does something well, but the other kid doesn't. And you'll say, to one of them, I just want to thank you for taking out the garbage. That was so thoughtful of you. You praise profusely in front of the other one. Well, it kind of works when they're 3 or 4 years old. When they're teenagers, they kind of roll their eyes and say, Dad, yeah, I know exactly what you're trying to do. Right. But that's that technique where you praise profusely someone else child A to send a message to child B. And it sounds like that's what he's doing. And when I was just reading up front, it sounded like he was doing that a little bit, saying, I just want you to know how great these other people were. They gave, and they were begging us to give. Look at verse 4, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. They were great. I mean, they were have I told you about them? I think I have. Let me tell you again. They're so great. That's what it sounded like a little bit.
But then in verse 7, but then he builds them up and he says, as you excel in everything, in faith and speech and knowledge and all earnestness, in our love for you, see that you excel in the act of grace also.
Yeah, and then right after that, verse 8 is really interesting because he says, I say this not as a command. Because that's, if he hadn't brought in that gospel part and hadn't brought this, he could have just done that and said, hey, this is the command, just do it. I do say this as a command, just do it. But he clearly does not take this approach. He says, I want to talk about how much this other church in their heart wanted to do the right thing. And then he says, I say this not as a command in verse 8. And right after that, in the second half of verse 8, but to prove by the earnestness of others that your love also is genuine. It's like, I'm just proving, like, I'm referencing these other people, but you guys do have this love in your hearts. You do have this desire in your hearts to do this right thing. And then he brings in the gospel. And right after that, he talks about a year ago, you started to do this work, and not only to start it, but also the desire to do it. So you do have your heart's in the right place. You want to do the right thing, just like this other church was doing. And what I want to encourage you to think about it, because Jesus is the one who is generous for you, and think about that. So it's almost like, I don't know, Greg, it's like, I don't just want you, what he's saying is, I don't want you just to do the right thing, but to want to do the right thing for the right reasons. Otherwise, you just give him a command and say, buck up and do it, right? This is your obligation. So, and he really doesn't do that.
Well, you want to read the rest of the chapter?
Yeah, let's do that. Do you want me to start?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, this is
verse 16.
Verse 16. But thanks be to God, who put into the heart of Titus the same earnest care I have for you. For he not only accepted our appeal, but being himself very earnest, he is going to you of his own accord. With him, we are sending the brother who is famous among all the churches for his preaching of the gospel. And not only that, but he has been appointed by the churches to travel with us as we carry out this act of grace that is being ministered by us for the glory of the Lord himself and to show our goodwill. We take this course so that no one should blame us about this generous gift that is being administered by us. You want to pick up there, Greg, in verse 21?
For we aim at what is honorable, not only in the Lord's sight, but also in the sight of man. And with them, we are sending our brother, whom we have often tested and found earnest in many matters, but who is now more earnest than ever because of his great confidence in you. As for Titus, he is my fellow partner and fellow worker for your benefit. And as for our brothers, they are messengers of the churches, the glory of Christ. So give proof before the churches of your love and of our boasting about you to these men. Okay,
so I got a question to start off.
Okay.
He's introducing a couple of characters into the story, and I got a little lost. How many characters are there? In particular, there's this mystery brother in verse 18, who's the brother who is famous. But then in 22, there's another brother. And I don't know if that's the same brother or multiple brothers.
I think it's three. And you know what I think is interesting is I think this shows that this is almost an accountability thing. Like when you collect money, you don't just do it alone. You don't have one person carrying the money. You have three people carrying the money so they can hold each other accountable, that they're not tempted to steal the money. But it is interesting who these two characters are. I did a little research. Some people think that the first guy mentioned in verse 18 might be Luke.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
But I think it also, in light of the Corinthians letters, it could be Apollos or Silas. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Apollos is the only one I thought of, just because Acts talks about him being such a great preacher, that he had great arguments. He was often going into the synagogues with great eloquence, refuting arguments for other people and arguing for the gospel. So when he talks about famous among all the churches for his preaching of the gospel, Apollos is the one that came to mind. But if it was Apollos, I mean, Paul in 1 Corinthians talks about how some people say, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos. In other words, I don't know why he would hesitate to not name him here. If it was Apollos, I would have thought they would have said, oh, by the way, I'm sending Apollos, and not say kind of cryptically, the brother who's famous.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure why he's not named. Although I kind of like it. I like it when there's kind of unnamed people in the Bible, because then it makes you realize that could be me or you.
Well, that God has a plan for no-name people like us, Greg.
Yeah, that's it.
We can play a role in this kingdom somewhere. That's a beautiful thing. You don't have to be. You can serve the Lord in total obscurity, which I really, really like. I really appreciate that. I like your point about 3 people, and I think that may be backed up by the words at verse 22, and it says, "And with them we are sending." Yeah, so with them, see, that's plural. With them we are sending our brothers, a third one. I think you're right. That makes sense. Whom we have often tested and found earnest in many matters. So he's trying to say them.
He's trustworthy.
Trustworthy, tried and true. We've often tested him, right? Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And then he goes back to Titus as well. So it probably sounds like Titus and 2 other guys. And I think they're male. He talks them brothers. So probably 3 men.
I've always appreciated in a church, like when they collect the offering, that there's more than, one guy doesn't take the offering back into the room to count it. Like, you always have like 2 or more people counting
at a good church, God willing, right? So
right.
Well,
that's been the experience of the churches I've gone to, and I've always appreciated that, because
I mean, I heard a Christian once say, look, it's not my obligation if they sin with the money, that's their sin before God. It's my obligation to give. And so I need to give. And if I'm giving, that I'm fulfilling my obligation before the Lord. But if they do some other sinful purpose with it, that's on them. And I don't know about that. I don't know if you have a reaction to that, Greg, but I don't know because I think there's some obligation you have to kind of give to worthwhile ministries that are kind of, they're trustworthy. I mean, Paul himself is trying to say, this is what we're giving to. It's these people that are starving in Jerusalem. There's a reason for it. We're not skimming salt off the top for ourselves. They're trustworthy men. So he's giving them reasons to be confident in it, not saying, just give me the cash and trust me, right?
Hey, I do want to say one more thing, just in kind of wrapping this whole section up, is, this idea of giving. And I've been blessed, living as a missionary, living on support. And one thing I'm convinced of is that true biblical giving is a vertical. So sometimes it feels horizontal, like when I have needs and I have to go out and raise money. I think when it's done correctly, ultimately I'm looking to God. I'm trusting in the Lord to provide for whatever the needs I might have. And hopefully the person is giving to God. Just this whole idea again of, if you're living if you have an eternal perspective, giving becomes a vertical, not horizontal.
Yeah. Well, that's right. I think, as Christians, you're right. We're giving to God.
I love that verse 9. Remember what Jesus did. Though he was rich, he became poor, so that through his poverty, we might become rich. And with that, stay tuned, because Jim and I are going to start discussing Matthew, the book of Matthew, I think chapters 21 to 28.
Okay, that's next.
That's next. But actually, what will be next after this will be my teaching on this passage.
That's awesome. All right, sounds great. Till next time then.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.